I'll let you know when to open the session, Ruchi.
Okay.
Okay, there's people are piling in. Great.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll just wait to hear from you when to open my camera and stuff.
Let's see. Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
We can start. Okay, over to you, Ruchi. We're recording. Okay.
Okay. There you go. Hi, everyone. I'm Ruchi Chaturvedi. I teach at the University of Cape Town. And we are part of a consortium called Other Universals, which is convened in South Africa at the University of the Western Cape, has partners at University of Cape Town, University of Johannesburg, and with Witwatersrand, but also American University of Beirut, as well as Ghana Legon, Addis Ababa, and University of the West Indies. So it's a big consortium. But the consortium be hosting Professor Denise Ferreira da Silva today. And I want to just sort of start us by not only introducing her, but speaking a little bit about why, as a consortium called Other Universals, her work has been important for us, and why she's somebody we wanted to hear from and talk about and read her work. So the Other Universals Consortium, it started like almost 2-3 years ago through the pandemic. And it's a consortium that tries to interrogate universals, universals ranging from, notions of human rights, humanity, even something like democracy, which is seen as a universal that all of us aspire to and hold up. But it wanted to interrogate these universals from what we might broadly call post-colonial locations, while constantly also asking how other universals have been thought through by marginal populations, by subaltern populations in South Asia, in Africa, in the Caribbean, and to put these places in conversation with one another. So it's in that context that Professor Denise Ferreira da Silva's work became important for us. And as you probably know, she's based at the University of the British Columbia. She's the author of Towards a Global Idea of Race. She's also the author or co-editor with Paula Chakravarti of Race, Empire, and the Crisis of the Subprime. She's somebody who brings in a range of disciplines, but also artistic practice and reflective thinking together, theorizing, philosophy, artistic practice, all of these together to weigh in on questions of raciality, of what she calls globality. And why, I mean, her understanding of raciality, the ways in which raciality challenges universal humanism, as well as liberal state and law. That's been very, very useful for us in the last year or so. As a consortium, we've come together with students and faculty to read her work. And she describes raciality as not just bias or prejudice, but a grammar that has made the workings of capital possible in the past and present, that haunt the nation state, that actually impacts the ways in which capital has progressed. So it's with that kind of thinking of notion of raciality, the ways in which it interrogates notions of humanism and law and liberal state, that we found her very, very, very generative, and asked her to come and speak to us today. And she's going to be talking especially from her forthcoming book, Unpayable Debt. So I'm going to switch off here and hand over to Denise. And Denise is going to speak for about 45 minutes, and after which we'll take questions. Thank you, Denise, and welcome.
Thank you, Ruchi, for this kind introduction, and also for the invitation to be part of this program. And I'd like to also thank Findy for the invite and the patience with the scheduling process, and also Ali for the tech support, and then of course everyone involved in the Other Universals Consortium for creating this opportunity, and obviously folks who are here attending this event. I am speaking from the unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Many of them are my neighbors because I live in the reservation, and I just want to say that I always want to say that I'm forever grateful for their kindness and hospitality under the ongoing colonial and racial violence that allows me to inhabit their ancestral lands. And as Ruchi said, I'm going to speak about about Unpayable Debt, which came out in not too long ago, in March this year. And I'm going to open with a few quotes, so bear with me. Go to my PowerPoint. Slideshow, play from the start. Okay, I have a few quotes. They're long, so that's why we need the slides. Beginning with Octavia Butler from her book, Kindred. I treated you good, said Wailing quietly, and you pay me back by stealing from me, stealing my books, reading. He snatched the book from me and threw it on the floor. Then he grabbed me by the arm and dragged me toward the door. Wailing dragged me a few feet, then pushed me hard. I fell, knocked myself breathless. I never saw where the whip came from, never even saw the first blow coming, but it came like a hot iron across my back, burning into me through my light shirt, searing my skin. I screamed, convulsed. Wailing struck again and again until I couldn't have gotten up at gunpoint. I kept trying to crawl away from the blows, but I didn't have the strength or the coordination to get far. I may have been still screaming or just whimpering, I couldn't tell. All I was really aware was the pain. I thought Wailing meant to kill me. I thought I would die on the ground there with a mouthful of dirt and blood and a white man cursing and lecturing as he beat me. But then I almost wanted to die. Anything to stop the pain. And then the next quotes from Hortense Spillers, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe. A female body strung from a tree limb or bleeding from the breast on any given day of field work because the overseer is standing the length of a whip has popped her flesh open, adds a lexical and a living dimension to the narratives of women in culture and society. This materialized scene of unprotected female flesh, ungendered, offers a praxis, a theory, a text for living and for dying, and a method for reading both through their diverse mediations. And then finally from Sojourner Truth, and I, Woman. When Barbara Christian asks, and I quote, what are the philosophical assumptions behind my praxis, end quote, and we assume that she means that of a Black feminist literary critic, I understand the term behind in two senses. In the sense of that which makes it possible, and in the sense of what would follow her praxis, what would become possible. A Black feminist poetical reading I offer is a version of such a praxis, one which attends to both, to what has made it possible and to what it makes possible. Another way of saying is that it answers to truth question by returning to the scene of subjugation, retold in Butler's novel Kindred, to what Hortense Spillers calls, I quote, materialized scene of unprotected female flesh, from which I derive Unpayable Debt as a praxis, a theory, a text, and a method for reading. How I do so differs in various degrees from other borrowings and other writings inspired by Truth, Butler's, Christian's, and Spillers' words. And there is no room here for even mentioning the actual and possible ways in which I depart from these existing readings. So all I can say is that in assembling Unpayable Debt, I borrowed and mixed and matched generously, but always aware of the implications of what I had to leave behind, what I could not get rid of, and what I added or subtracted as I combined different borrowings. Another way of saying that is that Unpayable Debt, as other tools and thought experiments I have devised, is Unpayable Debt is hunted from within by its own constituents, but it is also apt at spotting and restraining its inner demons in the same way as it knows how much these may trouble the openings it promises, makes possible, and welcomes. A tool of Black thought, it is offered as a contribution to the arsenal of the Black radical tradition as described by Cedric Robinson, for whom it includes the anti-slavery and anti-colonial marron communities and praxis across the Americas and the Caribbean, and the resonances in the anti-colonial struggles in Asia, Africa, the Pacific Islands, and even the European continent in the 20th century and even before. More particularly, this feminist contribution activates Blackness's potential to disrupt post-Enlightenment thought. And in doing so, it is very much in line with Saidiya Hartman, Tina Kemp's, J. Cameron Carter's, Fred Moten's, Catherine McTrick's, Nahum Chandler's, Alex O'Haley's, and Hazel Corby's indirect and direct interrogations of the approach that prevailed in 20th century phenomenology. And it is also informed by the same kind of post-structuralist perspective shared by many of these contemporary Black thinkers. With the difference, my take on Blackness, like Lyndon Barrett's, has an explicit historical materialist orientation, but one that takes Blackness as a tool for reading the global conditions. For in my view, Blackness exposes the centrality of violence and the very configuring of the liberal polity. And that supports the exploration of the philosophical openings created through a racial critique of modern thought, which include, among other things, different points of departure for a critique of capitalism, the consideration of alternative bases for ethical claims, and a reconsideration of the basic tenets of the field of the aesthetic. Let me go back here to my screen sharing. Unpayable Debt, the figure that has been used as a title for a book chapter, a collection of essays, and a monograph, which was released back in March, as I said. Unpayable Debt condenses and amplifies as it combines these lines of reflection. And the analytical tools they have yielded it combines them into a critical program a critical program in which Blackness guides the assembling of the global as a political conceptum. This is possible because as a racial category, and then as that in a manner similar to how indigeneity as well, Blackness figures, similar to how indigeneity as well as the figures of the refugee and the undocumented migrant, Blackness exposes how coloniality as a juridical modality marked by total violence, how coloniality operates in the extractive and expropriative infrastructures of global capital. However, the particular manner in which Blackness troubles the modern political text as a social scientific category that collapses the moments of the juridical and ethical is that it exposes how necessity as the opposite to freedom is inscribed in the very post-Enlightenment political architecture. And it is precisely this short circuit of liberty which shows the symbolic as a political moment composed of historic and scientific devices. That short circuit reveals Blackness' critical capacity, but it also invites a shift, a reconfiguring of Blackness itself as a philosophical concept, as a tool of radical thought, which captures how authorized total violence has remained operative in the post-Enlightenment arrangement and even in today's arrangement of the liberal architecture. And this is something it does not by adding or rearranging the modern political text, but by way of its capacity, and I'm talking about Blackness, its capacity due to the intensity of the force that it seems to request, its capacity to tear the fabric of modern thinking and to release the imagination, which then can explore all that is deemed and rendered impossible under the image of existence that supports the current ethical grammar and the political architecture it justifies. Another way of saying this is that the disruptive capacity of Blackness, the political concept, equals to the intensity of the violent force with which the self-preserving branches of the liberal authority meet Black persons. It is that disruptive capacity that the phrase unpayable debt activates in its operation as a reading tool that functions as Black light. How exactly it does so is something I will not address in this talk, though I'm happy to answer the questions about it, of course. But today I chose to describe how Unpayable Debt operates as a Black feminist reading tool, that is how it works as an image which, in Walter Benjamin's sense, interrupts the interpretive itinerary, bringing historical signification to a halt, even if for a moment, and in doing so finds total violence at the core of modern thinking and polity. What it does is to make visible the global as a political context mapped by the juridical infrastructure of coloniality and the ethical operators of raciality, that is racial difference and cultural difference, among others. So what I'll do is basically to share the moves deployed in the displacing of the prevailing explanation for racial subjugation, which I call the racial dialectic, and also in my reading of Marx's original presentation of historical materialism. As an image, Unpayable Debt allows me to read the post-Enlightenment themes of ethical and economic value in a way that shows how their coherence derives from the occlusion of juridical and economic components. On the one hand, because it recalls total violence, Unpayable Debt does not present racial subjugation as the effect of how a natural racial difference as datum or an historical racial differentiation as substratum provokes undesirable mental, moral, and intellectual reactions. In fact, it annuls the argument that racial difference generates unbecoming modern subjects, as it brings out discriminatory and exclusionary ideas and actions in these social conditions said to be ruled by the universal principles of equality and liberty. Instead, Unpayable Debt, by returning Blackness to the scene of subjugation, where Spillers, female flesh and gendered, exposes how total violence targets the will of the enslaved labor, Blackness also highlights how it is necessary to extraction and the expropriation of labor. On the other hand, that same wounded female body, producer of raw material as a worker in the field and of enslaved persons as a Black mother, that same wounded female body also recalls the signification of the fact that Marx's statement on the irrelevance of the colonies and slave labor to capital accumulation referred to what he calls the essential social conditions. But it means that the distinction between the colonial slave labor and living labor consists not in their subsumption under a different economic form, but in their placing in a different moment of social existence, one comprehended by juridical and ethical conditions, which a moment that Marx leaves undetermined. So by reading, that is figuring these statements against the way in which the products of slave labor, raw materials such as cotton and gold or iron, or used to build machines. So this product, by the way in which those products of slave labor are placed as irrelevant to the fact and understanding of capital reproduction, I find that this exclusion is not effectuated in the statements that perform the determination of capital, like those of the equation of time, labor, and production of value, or production of exchange value. Instead, I find that it occurs outside of the equation of value, so to speak, as this exclusion results from a distinct analytical gesture, which in the book I call delimitation. That is, it is an effect of infinite judgments, which are those that state that something is not part of a set, but does not establish which set it is part of. So I'll briefly describe how I read the ethical and economic scenes of value as moments of the play of universal reason in the post-Enlightenment period, and also how in this period I find both the Kantian formal transcendental and the Hegelian teleological transcendental informing the prevailing ethical program, as well as the juridical economic structures and the political symbolic arsenal. And incidentally, I should have said that at the beginning, this slideshow, it's not following any direct reference to what I'm speaking. It's just indirectly connected. So it's a different layer of text, as I'm sure you can tell by now. From Spiller's presentation of female flesh and gendered and Butler's Kindred's main character saga, but in particular from the moment that Dana goes under the whip, I read the slave as an ethical economic figure, person who is an instrument of production and reproduction. And I read her so to recall how, as an intractable ethical object, she continues to perform in the global present. Or another way of saying that, to express how Blackness reveals the global as a site in which the various moments of the post-Enlightenment political architecture operate in tandem. And those moments are the ethic, the economic, the symbolic and the juridic. A significant example of this operation is the 2007-2008 global economic crisis. So when attending to the pair state capital at that moment, Blackness as a global concept, as a descriptor for the political architecture of the global present, provides the key for understanding why in the US, for instance, economically dispossessed Black persons and families were blamed for a global economic crisis caused by those who thought to profit from their inability to pay for conventional loans, or put differently, that the racial construction as improper economic subjects forced them, that which forced them to take the subprime loans, that which forced them to take the subprime loans that rendered the mortgage securities, the mortgage-based securities risky, is what made them profitable. So the image of unpayable debt came to me exactly when I was trying to make sense of how that situation exposed the intimacy between the economic and ethical scenes of value, but in a way that did not stop at, by the closed circuit produced by the prevailing explanation for racial subjugation. Because that explanation, which I call the racial dialectic, placed Blackness as the category that refers to skin color or racial difference. It placed Blackness as a cause for exclusionary and discriminatory acts, that is, of unbecoming moral acts that create the social conditions that render Black persons into improper social subjects, ethical and economic bad subjects, bad payers, such as, the figure of the subprime loan holder, or render Black persons ethical and juridical bad subjects, that is, criminals, as evidenced by the number of Black persons in the US and elsewhere in the Americas in the criminal system, and more dramatically, as evidenced in the cases of police killing of unarmed Black and brown persons, killings that are justified, that is, ethically and juridically explained as self-defense, and it's done so without judicial review. So when I focus the wounded captive body in the scene of subjugation on the statements that on that global economic crisis, she works against the figuring of Blackness as skin color, which is the one presumed in the racial dialectic. So by staying in the ethical explanation for racial subjugation with her blood, the economic and juridical operates in Black subjugation shine. That is like black light thrown on what has become accepted explanation for the crisis of the subprime and have been accepted as justifications for police brutality and mass incarceration of Black persons. Like black light, the wounded captive body in the scene of subjugation, in that scene of the beating in Butler's novel that I read before, there she exposes something that Frederick Douglass had already noted in 1871. The slave master had a direct interest in discrediting the personality of those he held as property. Every man who had $1,000 so invested had 1,000 reasons for painting the Black man as fit only for the slavery. The holders of $200 million worth of property in human chattels procured the means of influencing press, pulpit, and politician, and through these instrumentalities, they belittled our virtues and magnified our vices, and have made us odious in the eyes of the world. Anyway, my point is that the wounded captive body in the scene of subjugation, when positioned before, in the sense of in front of anything said to actualize whiteness, cannot but reflect back the economic interest that would follow descendants of enslaved persons in the US and elsewhere. and followed as well beyond the abolition of slavery. Its appearance immediately breaks apart the racial dialectic, and in doing so, it exposes how racial difference, precisely because it is a scientific explanation for racial subjugation, how racial difference functions as a post-Enlightenment political symbolic device. And as such, the category of Blackness as a reference of skin color has continuously done what Sylvia Wynter Fine characterizes as the inscriptions of men too, which is to render those persons who are deselected by evolution as such, that is not encompassed by the ethical concept of humanity. And there is something as Afro-pessimism, and then Fanon even before them elaborates as intractable, because always already preposed, positioned in someone else's world, as Du Bois describes, like as an intractable subjectivity. And it is precisely that operation of Blackness vis-a-vis humanity and subjectivity that obtains the negative answer presupposed in the call for Black lives to matter. The economic scene of value. In Gayatri Spivak's misreadings of what she calls the great narratives of European self-representation, I find a move that's key to an anti-colonial Black feminist critique of cis heteropatriarchy, and also the coding of historical materialism's inheritance. Spivak's reading of Marx's statements on the Asiatic mode of production has inspired the move that sustains my reading of the relations between the colonial, the racial, and capital. And here in the Marxist version of the economic scene of value, the wounded captive body in the scene of subjugation recalls the intractable economic object, both laborer, human, and instrument, thing, whose value, and it's something Marx notes frequently, whose value resides in the extraction of the raw material out of which living labor, whose yield value, resides in its capacity to extract the raw material that out of which living labor will produce exchange value. So the move that allows for the preservation of the argument here is not so much a misreading as it is a shift from the question of what Marx said in the original presentation of historical materialism to the question of how he composes the account of capital. So just to say, I'm not trying to provide another interpretation of what Marx says, but actually describe how he says what he says. So in tracking that composition, what he says as a composition, I find that capital as a conceptum, and by that I mean the delimitation of its reach and the mapping of its operators, such as labor and property. So that could only be presented through two analytical gestures. The one that established what falls under the concept of capital, that is the determinative statements in which the equation of time, labor, exchange value is crucial for the scientific presentation of it as an economic concept, and the one that describes the essential social conditions for its emergence, that is the delimitative statements in which ethical notions of liberty and self-actualization and juridical aspects, such as reference to contract and to contract involving free agents, these juridical, ethical and juridical aspects allow for the specification of proper capitalist relations. So what my reading shows is how Marx does not establish to each mode of production the colonies and slave labor belong, or what determines them as such, that is, what plays the role of labor in that mode of production. It is sufficient for him to state that these are not elements of capital, that they do not belong to the set identified as capital. As such, he does not say that they are not capitalist, but that they are non-capitalist. This kind of negation is not a presentation of the opposite or of a particular, like a different mode of production. It actually fits Immanuel Kant's description of infinite judgments. It is the kind of negation that renders what does not fall under a given concept, in this case, capital, undetermined. So my reading of Marx's original presentation of historical materialism then foregrounds negation, but not in Spivak's sense of foreclosure and expulsion and disavowal. And there may be several aspects of this difference, but the one I highlight is precisely that in my reading, Marx's distinction does not set up a dialectical movement. So the colonies are not the order of England, and slave labor is not the order of wage labor. In fact, in that composition, they belong to essentially different social conditions. What they are economically, well, that remains undetermined. So my argument here is that it is the delimitation of capital as contingent upon globally and historically specific juridical conditions, in which the prevalence of formal liberty and equality allows for that human unique capacity, right, which is to produce, is the only explanation for why slave labor and native lands do not count as productive of capital and are placed in that anterior moment when the proper conditions for capital's inception is still, inception is still being assembled. And that positioning is both analytical and temporal. It's historical and theoretical. A moment that, like what Spivak notes in terms of the Asiatic mode of production, that moment does not belong to history as the temporal dialectical unfolding that leads to capital, nor does it belong to humanity as the figuring of the human as the sole productive existing thing because of its capacity to design and plan. But however, it is precisely because it does not belong anywhere that moment, the one in which the captive body in the scene of subjugation cannot but recall, well, that moment is up for grabs. It is available to the imagination, and it's there for the anticolonial critic take it and run with it. As I run with it, I find the wounded captive body in the scene of subjugation shining through the components of Marx's equation of value as it is presented in Chapter 7, Volume 1 of Capital. More precisely, I read her in the cotton balls planted and collected by slaves in Mississippi and the iron ore or gold mined by slaves in Minas Gerais. And both used in the production of the spindle, living labor also used in the production of the yarn in the English factory. And in doing so, ignoring Marx's delimitative statement, as well as his equation of liberty and property in living labor, I propose that capital production requires two distinct juridical structures: the colony, in which total violence ensures the appropriation of indigenous territories and extraction of total value yielded by their lands, and enslaved labor, and I call that expropriation, and the polity, the one in which contract, the laws of the liberal laws, which ensures the appropriation of part of value produced by wage labor in the factories. And that I call, I use the term that you usually use, which is exploitation. So what results from this reading of the economic and the ethical themes of value is precisely an exposition of how Blackness, the social category, when released from the racial dialectic, how Blackness holds the key for reading the global as the post-Enlightenment political context, as the conjunct of operations of the colonial, the racial, and cis-hetero patriarchal matrix. And it's so in all its moment, the economic, the ethical, the juridical, and the symbolic. Another way of saying that, Unpayable Debt, the one figured by Octavia Butler's Dana, that is the captive wounded body in the scene of subjugation. Unpayable Debt as black light reaches and breaks the code, the post-Enlightenment political architecture, as it exposes the fissures that signal how Blackness as a global conception does both sustain the reproduction of global capital and the physical violations it requires, and how we exist in it. And also it allows us to peer through the same fissures and envision the kind of shift at the level of thinking, which is necessary for conceiving of an ethical political program that is needed if we are to live otherwise on this planet. Thing and human, the captive body in the scene of subjugation recalls this intractable condition that figures the political through total violence of rape or murder that's present in every scene of beating. The threat of total violence is operative in the corner where the ethical and economic scene unfolds. In the ethical scene, it is seen as necessary for controlling the will of the enslaved person, which has to be there precisely because that control can never be assured. The owner overseer can never be sure that the slave cries, laughs, or works out of obedience or deception. That undeterminability also precludes an account of the enslaved as a subject of desire, that which keeps her off of the scene of subjectivity, but keeps her in the scene of citizenry as a subject of will. She is a political entity. What the reading exposes is how then that undeterminability marks her existing as a thing and as a human, which signals neither a double nor a duality, by the way. But to the extent that it is an aporia, it is so as a distinctive aspect of material existence, one which appears when it's approached quantically. And that aspect which is that every moment of determinacy exposes its dependence on linearity, on that which makes that which is made explicit as a violation of the limitations of space-time, or also as infinity. When addressed as such, the human as an existence, even if she remains a person, she is above all like, everything else that exists, or I should say not unlike. But I'm moving towards the conclusion. I have another couple of minutes. So let me conclude by commenting briefly on the shifts at the level of thinking Unpayable Debt hopes to inspire. And I'll describe each in reference to a commonly known philosophical term, because this is the level at which the image operates, I'm afraid. But this does not mean that Unpayable Debt is not concerned or it's not relevant in the consideration of real world issues. I think it's the opposite. As I said earlier, as I have said in different moments, the image comes out of an effort to show the connections between local and global events, between racial and colonial subjugation. And it's meant as a critical racial and anti-colonial feminist analytical tool, which recalls significant real political economic events with global reach, such as different economic crises, including the one I mentioned. And when doing so, the image works as a Black feminist reading tool. That is, it functions as black light, which is the only means for making that which had to be occluded for this world to make sense, what renders these connections between the racial, the colonial, and state capital visible. And as black light, while it makes the opaque, the occluded shine, the figure that drives the reading in Unpayable Debt, the wounded captive body in the scene of subjugation, also exposes the code, that is the philosophical grounds expressed in the infrastructures of post-Enlightenment thinking. And those are the onto-epistemological descriptors, formality and efficacy, and pillars, separability, determinacy, and sequentiality. And these infrastructures, by the way, compose our descriptive, reflective, determinative, and speculative tools. As it fails to fit the first distinction, the distinction between mind and body, for instance, or the Kantian distinction between man and thing, the wounded captive body in the scene of subjugation opens a space for thinking that does not have to make claims to certainty, and consequently does not need of the principle of identity and equality to support its intuitive statements. That, I think, opens up possible points of departure for thinking other than the still prevailing transcendentality, whether transcendentality is presented in the Kantian formal way, as is presented in juridical statements, or in the Hegelian final modality. That has obvious consequences in regard to the reigning presumption of transparency, both of the knowing subject with itself and its engaging with the world as other subjects, as its mirror, or as its mirror images, I'm sorry. So what becomes possible here is to engage subjectivity, the ontological presentation of the human, to engage subjectivity globally. And by that, I mean as a defining mode of existence of the human being, as well as temporality and historicity as its horizon. We can engage both of them racially. They are both become racially rendered. Meaning, by that I mean that both subjectivity and transparency become restricted to the white European bodies and territories. And I think that David Lloyd's argument in his book Underrepresentation does a great deal of this work of exposing how subjectivity is rendered in its very constitution, limited to Europe. But anyway, at the same time, the whole expanse of existence, which is called nature or world, and by that I mean the humans and non-humans existent, and the planet itself, may be released from the hold of the knowing subject, as the experimental results in particle physics and the observational ones in cosmology and the tools of quantum field theory indicate. And that's because once it is not possible to assert the what of something in terms of a unity, of that it is that what shows it's a separate, and then when it's not possible to say how exactly it is separate from others, intuitively or experientially, the other ontological pillars, as well as descriptors of modern thought, they no longer have a grasp of sense in terms of comprehensibility, of course. And the point of departure for describing all that exists becomes, ontological indeterminacy and deep implicancy. So this breaking apart of the post-Enlightenment onto epistemological infrastructures, it has many consequences. A most important of them, I find, is that without the separation between man, humanity, and thing, or the separation between subjectivity and world, the question is raised as to how then to reconstitute the domain of thinking that is being applied exclusively to the human as person, that is, that which is being conceived as an individual and social identity. How to reconstitute this domain? when we start with the wounded captive body and the scene of subjugation as through her indistinction between human and thing. So I think it's here that she does most of the work when focused as Black light, because here she dissolves the infrastructures of thinking that compose the ethical and economic scenes of value. And in doing so, shows how the ethical and economic, as well as the symbolic and the juridic, they are at play, working together. For the move that shows the colonial relations as heteropatriarchal operating within the various moments of the post-Enlightenment political architecture, that move also invites reflection on how else to devise and apply descriptive terms that figure existence in a way that takes into account the complexity that she reveals. And now really concluding, Unpayable Debt is a phrase, an image, an invitation, and a dare, as it recalls refusal in many senses, but very directly in the daring to say the unspeakable and to mean the incomprehensible. And it also recalls Dana's refusal to comply to the order of not to read, which back then and there in antebellum Maryland also meant to steal from the slave owner. As such, that is, as a Black feminist poetical tool, Unpayable Debt reflects that which it has been devised to expose. As a reading tool, it performs all the gestures related to this task. It is a study from a particular point of view. As it scans, it goes through the post-Enlightenment arrangement of the economic and the ethical scenes of value, but as it does so, it functions like ultraviolet rays. It interprets what it exposes, and it also recomposes the codes that establish how these themes are to be seen, what belongs to them, and how they work. It is a Black feminist reading tool and analytical device which in daring to deal with the intractable, to mean the incomprehensible, to contemplate the yet unimaginable. It exposes coloniality as a juridical modality and raciality, both of them as integral components of the post-Enlightenment political architecture, and as such as crucial to the functions of state and the accumulation of capital in the global present. Thank you for your patience. I hope I didn't go too long.
No, thanks so much, Denise. The way that we thought we would open the forum up was take questions in chat. And I should have said this before, that please feel free to pose questions there. If you're really keen, I can try to also unmute you and have you speak if writing is not your thing at all. But we thought this way, at least through the chat, we could take in more questions. And this is, I mean, these are, we've traversed very deep and like complex questions and try to listen to Denise with her. So I'm sure there's some digesting that needs to happen. So while we're waiting for other folks to sort of, pose their questions on chat, Denise, Professor Da Silva, I'll use both terms right now. I thought maybe I could sort of pose a few questions as starters, things that emerged also in the course of the other Universal Consortium members reading your work together. And there were a bunch of them, and like I said, I hope others can pose their questions on chat, but some of the questions that came up for us were around the difference between coloniality and colonialism, and colonialism as sort of thought to be a historical process that often sort of takes very particular forms in the shared condition of coloniality. And you speak of both, and I just want to sort of hear about this difference between the particular conditions and processes through which colonialism often unfolds in particular places and forms it takes, shapes it takes in South Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, versus coloniality as a larger condition. And what struck me also that, while you speak of extractive forms as well as slave labor as sort of ongoing conditions of capital, you don't necessarily use the word primitive accumulation while discussing Marx. And I was just sort of wondering why, or what, what your thinking about that is. And last, I think I can sort of infinitely listen to you on the poetic and poetic as a method, but also an intention. So these are questions that I'm sort of taking from the reading groups that we've had last year in October and more recently. But there are other people from those groups who are here, as well as a bigger group, and I'm sure people will pose their questions. Yeah, so I'll also, can I just throw in Victoria's question?
Oh, can I just respond to you?
Sure. Yeah.
And no, thank you, Lucia, for all three questions, which, yeah, they're all very much connected, because also they open for a conversation, which would be really nice to have. Yes, it's true. I make the distinction between colonialism and coloniality, and I think I spend more time talking about coloniality, and then I'm curious about how the conversation goes among you, because I wonder how you use coloniality. But let me share how I do, and then we can converse. And it's very simple. I take coloniality as the term that captures a particular mode of governance or a juridical modality, and the juridic modality that is defined by the deployment of total violence. So as such, coloniality, if going back to 1492, coloniality definitely is the prevailing mode of governance in the colonization in the Americas, in that experience, and then later on in other places too. But it has remained operative in the global context. So, for instance, one of the many horrible examples of it is, and it's the most dramatic one, perhaps the most dramatic in a way, but it's not alone, it's not the only one, is the DRC. So thinking of the DRC from the initial gesture of King Leopold's, the massacres back then, and tracing how violence in the DRC has remained as dramatic, but never undermining extraction, actually facilitating the extraction. So it's that operation that I find, basically, I find coloniality inseparable from extraction in that sense, and it has always accompanied capital from the very early years of as merchant capital through industrial capital, and now it continues under a more prevailing financial figuring of capital. And I think so. One of the moves that I'm making in terms of thinking is precisely proposing a description of the modern political architecture that identifies the operations of both, right? Of the liberal polity and its universal principles and polite disagreements, and and along with it, the operations of coloniality as a juridical modality. And so that connects the question on primitive accumulation, because basically, one way of introducing the argument I make in the monograph, in Unpayable Debt, monograph, but it is also in the introduction to the special issue of American Quarterly with Paula Chakravarti. We make that there. It is a refusal of primitive accumulation as the proper descriptor, as a proper way of connecting the colonial context in the Americas in this case, but beyond, but in this case in the Americas, the colonial context with capital. So if you read the book, you see that I think in pretty much every chapter, I kind of go back to a discussion of historical materialism and primitive accumulation, but the main argument there is that primitive accumulation, the phrase itself, it has both an historical and it does an historical and an analytical removal of colonial of the colonial from the how do I say that? Because it is, as I say in the talk, there is no moment of determination, right? Marx never says it is the colonies and slave labor belong to a different mode of production. It is always a moment of saying it's not capital. It's not to be understood under the concept of capital. It's actually it made it possible, the initial accumulation that then would be, used in the production of capital. So, but then in Marx, I find this distinction as a delimitative one. So primitive accumulation refers to the colonies, primarily to the colonies in statements that delimit what is properly capital. But later on with Rosa Luxemburg and others, then the deployments of primitive accumulation, they take place in accounts that render the colonies and then slave labor with that temporally anterior, historically preceding capital, or a more anthropologically anterior, meaning especially when Rosa Luxemburg is describing the natural economies found in the continent. So it is an anthropological distinction. So that is the determination is given out after Marx, but not necessarily in economic terms. So if the natural economy is an anthropological concept, right? It's not a concept that is part of the critique of political economy. It's an anthropological concept that allows for the account of the use of force, because capital, the reproduction of capital can only take place under the polite ways of liberalism, right? In a sense, so Marx is very much a very good liberal thinker, but I'm not going to say more of it because I'll be I can make enemies. But anyway, but we can go to Victoria's question and then I can talk about the poetical.
Sure. I mean, Victoria's question, I'm not sure if everyone can read this. So I'm just going to read it out. She's asking Professor De Silva, to speak more in terms of Black light and the disruptive capacity of Blackness. So yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, this is so Black light is something that came to me when I was working on a paper which was supposed to be about the colonies and primitive accumulation was a paper but luckily it wasn't a paper for an academic conference. It was a paper for an art panel, organized, was in Amsterdam, the museum in Amsterdam. And I was looking at the work of Ottobong Kanga, and Ottobong So I was, okay, no, actually before that, I did the paper on, let me remember, that was a few years ago. I did the paper for the conference, and then Ottobong was performing as part of the conversation. And then that was when I encountered her work, and then I was writing something else, and I brought the two together. So the paper was mostly a critique of primitive accumulation without black light, but the beautiful. But the inspiration from Ottobong's work came out of, she's not making a distinction between places of that, spaces of darkness, the mines, in particular the mine in the Green Hill mine in Namibia, and spaces of shine, talking about copper, and then of course the idea that came to me, and I continue to explore and explore in the book itself, is that when you look at, which Ottobong does, when you look at the spaces of shine in Europe from blackness, you can see of course it takes other things through blackness as a political concept, right? Or an analytical tool, you won't see just copper, you see the copper mines also, right? That where the copper is from. Or if you look in being somebody from Brazil, like when you look at some things, you don't just see something that it's made out of iron and it's strong, whatever, but you can remember the iron ore of the mines from Minas Gerais. So the inspiration that came to me was, when you see, and of course there is a joke with Enlightenment and the centrality of visuality in modern thought, but when you see with black light, you see precisely that which has to be rendered invisible or unimportant, but it's always there. It has to be present, so that it is impossible for Marx. It would have been impossible for Marx to write the equation of value in the ways in which he writes, for instance, in chapter 7, volume 1, without making reference to the spindle and the cotton, right? There is no way, because it has to talk about the worker, living labor working that machine, and getting the cotton balls through the machine in order to produce the yarn. But that's not what explains value in that sense. Only when you look at it with black light that you look at, oh, the cotton and the iron they're both there, right? So that's step one. So that the step which is still a play with enlightenment and light and black light and light, but then black light, UV rays, they are the high frequency, right? So they're immediately above visible light, and then before X-rays and gamma rays. And as we know, if you are exposed to UV light, you have the risk of getting cancer, because UV light, as it makes shine, it also goes deeper, and it reaches the code, not only the flash, but the form itself, and it shifts the form. So it isn't that, and to me, that force, when you think of that force through blackness, it is the continued force of torture that in the scenes that I read at the beginning of the paper, that gives black light, blackness, that capacity to undo that which has been made possible through the deployment of total violence. And to me, this is poetical, right? That's the poetical reading, right? It's a reading with an orientation. Reading with black light is a reading with an ethical orientation, which is of pointing the moment of erasure, exposing that which is being erased. And in that sense, quoting Spivak again, exposing the epistemic violence that takes place at that level, but at the same time, in doing so, also undoing the whole thing, right? Undoing. That's why I call it infrastructures, because it's not only about the structures or the infrastructures, but and I use infrastructures in borrowing from Karen Barrett's notion of interaction, right? The little elementary particles that constitute things. That's the level.
I mean, yeah, I'm sort of left a little bit speechless after that, because I think I learned so much in just that response. Nelly has a question about, sort of building on this, but Shahid has had his hand up for a while. So before I read Nelly's question, Shahid, do you want to go and ask yours? And then we'll come to you, Nelly. I'll read up your comment question on the chat. Shahid?
Okay, thanks so much. I just thought, can you hear me? I just, thank you, Professor Da Silva. I just thought it might be easier to say, but I managed to write it down. Okay, so you identify how the female, enslaved body is unthinkable in the Marxist post-Enlightenment thought, which then itself becomes a location through which to think outside this. Now, I'm interested in the way you highlight, the fact that something that cannot be separated, cannot be objectified, so cannot be made comprehensible, doesn't actually exist, and this becomes then the ontological challenge. So my question is, what does this mean for modern disciplines, like anthropology? Sorry, so I'm coming from anthropology, which are forged in this very period, and that keep on, and despite all kinds of reflexivity, etc., return to this. Where they rely on this process of representation, objectification, and identification. And the second part is, what is the relation between the status of, for want of a better term, the native voice, but more than that, language, discourse, and pragmatics, and your evocation of the unpayable debt? And what happens after exposure, or is exposure the praxis?
Thank you, Shahid, for the question.
I hope
You finished?
Yes. Sorry, I just said I hope that it's clear.
What happens after exposure? So in terms of modern disciplines and thinking about the social sciences, I was trained as a social scientist. My degrees are in sociology, but I was actually trained very much so as an anthropologist. And the beginning, there is an origin story of it, which it all begins with my number one, my insatisfaction with the ways in which sociology, for instance, explains racial subjugation. Number two, now that insatisfaction led me to write my PhD dissertation and then the book as a critique of both sociology and anthropology, and one that exposes, maybe going to your final third question, that exposes how these disciplines, they are sites of, again, sites of epistemic violence, how they participated in the production of subjects that could then, for instance, be subjected to total violence, whether subjected to total violence in the former colonial spaces, or could be become object of total violence without that generating any kind of ethical crisis under a mode of thought that supposedly is under a social condition that it's governed by universal principles that should embrace any other. So in regards to the disciplines, social scientific disciplines, my arguments that those disciplines, they are part of the modern liberal juridical architecture. And they are so as they, along with the humanities, right? Social scientific tools and historical tools, they compose what I call the political symbolic moment of this architecture. So another way of saying that is that part of the work, which is the corner of the philosophical and philosophical theoretical, but I think it's more on the philosophical side. But part of the work is precisely to provide a different image of the political context, one that takes into account those different dimensions, including the work of knowledge. And that obviously, it reflects my generation, right? I am of a generation that was in Brazil, but not only in Brazil, of a generation that was very much influenced by post-structuralist thinking, very much influenced by Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, but also very much unhappy with the limits of the limits of their own critique of maybe the European limits of their critique of modern thought. So that's a general answer to the first part of the question. Now, the question, if I understood you, you asked me about the native voice, the place of the native voice. Maybe two things. On the one, no, maybe just one thing, that the place from where I am advancing, making those propositions, which is a place that it's figured with and by Blackness. It is a place that it's right fully within modern thinking. And Blackness, and thinking of Blackness as such, right? Blackness is a category of European thought. Blackness that it's imposed on people of African descent as a description, as a racial descriptor, right? As a part of racial theorizing. So the critique is from that perspective. Now, there is a lot in the ways in which the critical project is designed that resonates, and and probably that resonates with indigenous, and I use the term indigenous philosophy. If I understand your question correctly, I hope I'm understanding what you mean by native voice. I think there is a lot that resonates, and I think they can be combined. The critical project here can be combined with and deployed alongside indigenous critique, indigenous critiques, but it's not. So it's not supposed to displace. It's not borrowing. It's just something else to be added to the range of possible critiques of modern European thinking. That's how I'm going to. That's how I choose to answer the question, because that is another way of answering the question, but I don't want. It would take too long. And what happens after exposure? Yeah, well, that's the thing, isn't it? One of the problems that happens. One of the problems with exposure is that it may render the political form and the forms and the strategies and assumptions we have absolutely, it may expose them as being absolutely useless to countering modern power, precisely because they're made of the same stuff, right? So they are effective as political strategies or rhetorical strategies or critical strategies precisely because they make sense. So that is that, which I think actually is very much true. But at the same time, at least in my view, the movement of exposure is also an invitation to the imagination, not only to imagine and think otherwise, but also there is an invitation, or maybe just an opening towards living in this world in a different way. And that can take like huge fancy of the imagination, and or it can take maybe engaging in political activities or political practices that, for instance, refuse the separation between that which is seen as properly political and that which belongs, let's say, to the sphere of reproduction and care. And then something that refuses the separation between the distinction between that which is seen as properly theoretical and that which is only seen that what you think belongs more to the creative side of things and then should not be mixed. So all those larger and smaller gestures of living in the world already inhabiting this space in a different way. So I think that it doesn't happen after exposure, it happens with the exposure. Because the exposure actually, if it goes, I mean, to me, that what Blackness can expose goes all the way to the, to this, both in terms of all the way through that which informs our everyday ideas of what's proper and acceptable, through the more, abstract and ones.
No, thank you, Professor De Silva. Actually, the question that Nelly has, I think, fits in with this last point about exposure and what it leaves us with and what it makes possible. So aside from noting that Nelly absolutely loves your work, and for those of people who are not within the Other Universals Consortium and not known, the first person who asked the question, aside from me, was Victoria Collis-Buthelezi from University of Johannesburg, Shahid Tayyip, who introduced himself, and he's at Stellenbosch if people want to be where our affiliations are. And Nelly's is at WITS and a PhD student at WITS. So she's asking, my question is about the undefinable particle called blackness that functions as a disruptive capacity, but in a time when we still experience moments of inertia through coloniality and colonialism. So it is almost as though exerted force is equal and opposite to disruptive force. But per individual, that exerted force becomes gross and huge. And thinking about George Floyd and the most recent incident that happened at Stellenbosch University. Professor De Silva, I'm not sure if you know about this. I can fill you in, or Nelly, maybe you can. To what degree or what measures can blackness take shape as individual or undetermined, and yet still reduce individual impact of both inertia and constant force and collective struggle? But I mean, Stellenbosch University just saw a student, a white student urinating in a Black student's room and on their property, and saying things that I will not repeat in the wake of that. So that's the incident that happened there.
Thank you for the question, and thank you, Ruchi, for I spent 5 weeks at Stellenbosch back in 2010. So was so impossible. Was one of the most difficult place to be in. But it's another conversation to be had, which is not separate from, I think, from the question, right? So it's nice because the question, if I understand that it correctly, provides a Newtonian description of force in terms of, thinking of one thing and another thing and exhausting absorption of force from the outside, right? From exteriority, which I think it is exactly how the racial dialectic function when it's supposed to explain, when actually not when it's supposed to explain. That's how the racial dialectic works when it's deployed to explain racial subjugation, and it ends up justifying racial violence. Or on the case of George Floyd's murder, or it works out in terms, and I'm not saying that's how it's working out at Stellenbosch, because Stellenbosch also feels like part of the whole thing I'm going to speak about now, but that these students who urinated and did whatever it is that Richard didn't share the details, that takes that person as an exception, right? As exceptional. So that that logic that keeps as a description of power as exterior, which is the Newtonian description of force, that is still very much influences our thinking. And what I'm trying to get at, and it obviously requires the imagination, is to think of the force not in let's say not in mechanical terms like in the Newtonian terms, but in the electric, the electromagnetic terms. Now the force that comes through. So it's not a force that is then about hitting something and shifting or making things move, but the force that, and we call it energy, right? That comes through, and if you apply enough, like UV rays to your code, it will change the code, and it will bring about disintegration at the most basic fundamental level. Now, how do we do this, right? I mean, the question is always the question of the translation. How do we translate this into into a different way of facing our social, our racial, global circumstances, or how do we translate it into into some mechanism or some tools that would also bring about the shift. And this is where I think we have to stop collectively and think, because well, as I was saying just before, because any movement, now think in terms of the exterior movement, any movement that is taken within the liberal context, it will either be met with the force of the state, which is very much a Newtonian juridical entity, so it comes out exteriorly with force to destroy you, or it will not be met with force. It will just going to come into the institutions, and then eventually become an instrument of operating in favor, in support of global capital or of global state capital. I haven't seen, I've been paying attention for a long time now, almost 40 years, almost. And I have yet, and then thinking through all the different moments of, and I'm speaking primarily political, in political terms, of those different moments in strategies of the 20th century. And yes, I haven't seen one that has not either been crushed, like the Black Panthers, or being absorbed, like Black Power. For instance, those are two examples from the Americas of the past 50 years. So I think what I'm trying to say, without saying explicitly, is that really we have to start from scratch, right? I think we have to start from the realization that the liberal architecture does not work for us. That there isn't a huge difference between, let's say, Putin and Biden. What's causing all those people to be killed in the Ukraine, both sides is a nightmare of liberalism, because it is the imperialist state is not an exception of, it's actually one. When I used the Kantian formal transcendental and the Hegelian historical transcendental, those are the forces that play in that war. Those are the forces that are killing so many people. It is a Hegelian, in the name of the nation state, Putin, and the liberal force of the US and NATO. So anything that we do that makes sense, within this political architecture is, it's never, always carries the possibility that coloniality as a juridical modality will eventually be deployed against us. And when I'm talking against us, I'm talking about those of us non-European, non-white folks, not only Black folks. So I know there is the urgency, and there are the ways in which we remain doing the political work, involved in political work within this context. But as an academic, as somebody who likes to think about thinking and thinks that there is a lot of work to be done at that level, I think that this work is also important. I think I'm going back to answer the other question, but I think it has to do with also the description of the question of force. I think, okay, going back to the question about force, I think we may need a description of the political that takes seriously, as I'm trying to, a different conception of force, and experiment with what becomes possible by doing so.
Denise, actually, I mean, the two following questions from Aaron Kamugisha, who's at the University of West Indies, Cave Hill, and right now at Smith College, they sort of build, and another question from Victoria, they build on things that you just said in response to Nelly. Aaron is asking about the difference that you see between the political claims made about the state by liberalism and Marxism. Do you see a difference between those? And you invoke the liberal spectre just right now. And Victoria is talking about your essay on globality and returning to this question of self-determination. I mean, I'm tagging along with what Victoria said, but there's self-determination and national sovereignty and so on, as you know, has been such a important investment for this part of the continent, for where I come from South Asia. And but as you point out, raciality has been built into it. So can we sort of also, and something that Victoria is asking you to, and maybe even I'm asking you to do, if this critique of the nation that you offer is it also extendable to liberal democracy? So sort of bringing together Aaron's questions and Victoria's with my own. And I see there's another comment. I'm going to try to read it. Yeah, so maybe if you can answer this, and then we'll take Chika's question.
Yeah, well, takes us back to my difficulty answering the previous question, because it has to do with the goal, right? The goal of our political struggle. If you're thinking, I mean, if you're thinking about South Africa 30 many years ago, or even thinking about Brazil right now, because we are under threat with Bolsonaro. Or they're also thinking about, again, the Ukraine and what Putin is doing there. It's almost impossible not to think that, well, democracy is our, we can't afford not willing, hoping to be governed by a liberal democracy. We cannot afford under these conditions, because under these conditions, especially under these racial global conditions, we are really under threat of that total violence becomes the prevailing mode of operation, isn't it? Mm. And I think that is, but how do we counter that? So how do we counter these? I don't, and I'm trying, and the difficulty comes because I don't want to say, oh, how do we counter this authoritarianism? Because, because that keeps us in that context with, in this, where those are the only options. So what I'm trying to imagine, and obviously I can't do it alone. So when talking about those things is only an invitation to people to come and play, is to think even, I mean, we need to imagine a mode of social, the mode of, for organizing social existence that has the benefits of that the liberal democracy promised to everybody and never gave to those of us who are not white or European, right? Who holds that without, but that without what has always made it possible, which is total violence, which is coloniality, which is extraction elsewhere, right? I mean, I know how I can live in a certain way in Canada because of how Canadian mining is all over the place, rendering life impossible for Indigenous folks elsewhere, right? And there is a way in which I can live in a certain way here where I live, and I live in the West, because of how my neighbors, who are the owners of this land, live here. And I live the professor upper middle class life, and they live the fourth world Indigenous life, and we live in the same street. So we know that. So how do we keep the benefits of an upper middle class life without having the economic and social, but let me just say, the economic conditions that actually sustain this? And this is a question I think we have to not only that we have to ask, we have to be better at formulating it, and also considering the implications of even raising the question. The implications are the acknowledgement that even though it's been bloody, liberal democracies have been, good as aspirations. And then at the same time that it has been bloody, and there is no guarantee. And actually, I doubt that it can survive without violence. So, and then if that's the case, then the task is to design a whole different mode of living in this world that would, take care of, that would not be a liberal democracy, and that would not be, nightmare of that is life in Brazil and in other places. And I'm saying this because I don't know. I have no idea. I mean, I have some ideas, but I don't have any answers. We all have some ideas, but what I think that is crucial is that we begin to think about it. We begin to ask the question. So the name of your consortium, like other universals, right? I mean, do we need universals? I have been thinking with infinity. I've been wondering, what if, and I have written about it, like the image, we have the image of existence, the image that precedes anything we talk about, precedes any talk about existence, any description of existence. What if toward infinity? What if instead of thinking in terms of individuals, we thought of any existing thing as, I call it 1 plus infinity minus infinity, as a singular composition, which is always undetermined by everything else with which it lives. What kind of description, what kinds of, plan for social existence would become possible and imaginable? Would it liberal democracies, for instance, that is the assumption of the individuals and collectives with their self-interest and all those things that if you begin without the one, if you begin with the one, that the one is always also more than and less than a one. Would we describe the political in terms of a field of interests, of conflicting interests that needs to be negotiated and reconciled? I don't know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, no. I mean, there's a way in which that modality itself is already, went hand in hand with emergence of capital. I mean, what we know as liberal democracy, the notion of competition, individual equality under law without actually people being substantively equal. Those are sort of, so there's a way in which those two go together.
And the necessity for representation and the expectation of unity, right? Expectation of unity that can be given, how do I say, formally, right, under the state, but unfortunately, for like 200 years or more, is also given through blood and race and the nation, and we end up with the massacre in Buffalo, New York, right? I mean, so how do we, I don't know.
I mean, I think there's an intractable, and I mean, impasse can only be productive. I'm going to point to 2 questions. I haven't had it, Aaron's just came on, so I haven't had a chance to read it through properly. But Chika asked a while ago about the relationship, about thinking about Blackness as a racial category and transcending that. And I mean, when you sort of said other universals and posed a question about that term itself, I think Chika's sort of in a way taking us back to that term, but via Fanon, and asking about like Fanon's term of new humanity and the ramifications of that, and if they speak to you. And maybe then we can take Aaron's question after that, and that might be, maybe if that might be the second last question or the last question for the evening.
I'll try to be quick, fast in the answer. So the question of Blackness and Fanon, that's it.
And the new humanity. I mean, Fanon's notion.
Yeah, well, so Blackness to me, just the violence visited upon us, to me, is the key to the total unraveling. And to grasp that, I do play with Blackness as the writing of Blackness as a social scientific category which hides the violence. It is the construction of Blackness as a category of racial difference that envelops of that Frederick Douglass is talking about the investment in keeping, in constructing the Black person as a bad subject, right? As somebody who should be under the control of the police. Now, if that carries the potential for a new, for some other ways of imaging the human, I read the question, I hear the question as such. As such, yes. But that human, and that's why I also play with the intractable subject, which is a thing and a person. So that human would not be assumed to be as separate from everything else in the ways in which the human, humanity figures the human, right? So if you beginning with the Blackness from that enslaved person, a person and a thing, a raw material, something that has used value, but also a producer of other human beings whose work, whatever Marx says, is productive, even according to his own logic. That intractable subject, I think, if we begin with her, then the human has to become something else. So that's what I. And the other one was.
It's Aaron. It's not sure if there's a question or more of a comment in some ways. And thinking along with you about liberal democracy and its existence, that it continues to exist with colonial violence and exploitation of working class and poor in the West and in the neo colonies. If that's the case, then what other kind of state project exists? And Aaron is noting that his sense is that though there have been other such state projects that have tried to imagine a future without domination, and these have been socialist projects, they have failed because of the power of capital and their own contradictions. So, hopefully that doesn't mean that there are no futures that can be reimagined, but I guess, we're not necessarily being able to just propound something redemptive.
Yeah, no, yes, I agree. There have been other. We have imagined other futures, right? So maybe the question is, not the question, maybe the task. One of the tasks is to take it seriously. All those things, right? The fact that liberal democracies have been made possible by coloniality, right? The fact that it's not that we haven't been able to imagine other futures, but that we are limited by our own investments in liberal democracies, right? Which hold us back in terms of how the movement, the movement, what's necessary for breaking with it. And then, but I think what stops us is, several things, but like on the one hand, there is always the concern with falling on the other side or running the risk of being unprotected. Hence, beginning with the unprotected might be the way. So on the one hand, that is a feel, that fear, and I forgot what I was going to say. I can't believe it happened. But I think it had to do in regards to the question. The urgency, right? Which, in a way, ends up forcing us to give quick, answers that then, when we think through, it just doesn't take us too far away from from where we are. And so, yeah. But in a way, it's like after 2 years of this pandemic, and then it begins with a war. I mean, we have to put an end to this thing because, because I think it may be that during the Trump administration, I had this feeling that we're going into 1,000 years. It's going to be just like the Middle Ages. It'll be 1,000 years of horror. So maybe the plan is, how do we live under this horror? Maybe instead of just of the big plans of changing the state and reforming liberalism, how about we create our own little things inside of this construction, within this architecture, and make sure we do the work in such a way as to minimize the effects of this horror on our people. There is no other way of saying that. So do the political work at both levels. You do the political work at the university, teaching and writing, but also do the political work of making it possible, sometimes through channeling resources from the university to other contexts. Even if the resource is your time, because I can't wait for the revolution anymore. And I like to say I'm the last generation in Brazil that believed in the revolution. We came of age at beginning in the middle 1980s, mid 1980s, before the fall of the Berlin Wall. So yeah, I don't know.
I mean, I don't, want to exhaust you, and it's quite late in Cape Town. I mean, South Africa as well. But there are two sort of. There's one comment in the chat, and one term that we haven't spoken about. You evoked heteropatriarchy, while talking about raciality and its relationship to colonialism and capital. And I found myself asking how do you think about masculinity there, like as it is presented to us, as we've been living it out. It's got a certain kind of a universal thrust of its own, but that's sort of it, only if you want to take it up. But there's a comment that I'm going to quickly just read from Rithuli Orlane, who notes that they wish that they'd known about your work before today. And they were struck by your comment that you grew up at a time when you were influenced by Derrida and postmodernist thought, but at the same time, you found the work limiting. And especially when one has to think in Blackness as an analytical category. And Rithuli is keen to follow the work, your dissatisfaction, because they're also seeking to foreground Black and Indigenous people in the work of writing South African Xhosa history and historiography, where both the Marxist tradition and the postmodernist writings have reached an interpolated limit that undercuts the ability to do more theoretical, meta-historical work. So yeah, I guess
that's nothing to add. I'm looking forward to reading your work.
Yeah.
No, literally, yeah, nothing can add. So about the masculinity, well, we know, right? The university is one of the most masculine structures that is, and it's so inscribed in its universal operations and pretenses. But I only realized that really, I mean, I knew that as as an academic like everybody else, but when I became the head, the chair of my unit, and started making case about salaries and stuff, and I could see how those structures are so fundamentally masculine. But but the way I like to, no, I have been using the phrase colonial, racial, cis, heteropatriarchal matrix of the liberal subject. So it's the image of the transparent eye, but that entity is not a formal thing hovering above us like air, that invisible air, but it's actually only made possible because of these these attributes. And I have been thinking with that, with the I call it the arche form of the political subject, in which with the image of it as also an entity that is characterized by authority. So we have this image of the liberal subject, equality, liberty, and what's the other one? There is another one. So it's equality, liberty. I just forgot that.
Fraternity.
No, well, yeah, well, that is something like fraternity in the sense of its yeah, of its. I have it in my hacking the subject, but we usually don't talk about authority because authority seems to be precisely what that figure has relinquished to the liberal, to the politic, to the body politic, right? In order to be protected. Or property, the juridical. And but then if you recall for instance, the first treatise on civil government, which is all about the patriarch, which in the second treatise is in one chapter, and Locke's second treatise, you just remember that authority has never been taken away from him in the household, right? In the household, but then in the household, he's the father, he's the husband, he's the boss of the servants, but in the household in the Americas, he's the settler and the slave owner. So when I think of this as heteropatriarchal matrix, I think of the liberal subject as that embodied figure, and that then he's masculine, right? He's the father. And he's also, but it's not only masculine in thinking biological terms, but also as in the liberal text, in the figure of the patriarch, which is, so the subject, the liberal subject, as we know, and the feminists have been saying it forever, is the patriarch. And the patriarch is the settler and the slave owner. To me, like, in a way, it's bringing that figure down to its historical moment, instead of the lifting of that historical moment that is what comes through in political theorizing, right? It becomes that, transparent thing, but the movement, and then we can bring it back and keep it's still formal, because it can describe that entity through its relations, which are still juridical relations with the wife, the children, the serfs, and the colony as a settler and the slave. It's still a juridic entity, but one that is defined through its relations, not with the same, but with its relations with that which we see maybe as property, but not necessarily in terms of relations. So I think that's a crucial point of departure for a critique of our global conditions of existence, the ways in which it still operates in all those structures.
No, thank you so much. I think, I mean, there was the talk, and then this Q&A session. I think I can speak for many of us that there were moments of clarification, moments of real luminous thinking that we got from you. And the authority figure also unfortunately emerges in the figure of the liberator. And we're all living under that condition and continue to do so. But whether exposure can also sort of, produce new imaginations and how we might live them out, that remains to be seen. I'm going to sort of now close the session, but with a huge thank you to you. And this was really, really very, very fantastic. And yeah, very fantastic as a phrase, but very fantastic. And I hope you come and visit us, and you come to Cape Town again, and it hopefully won't be like a 2010 visit.
Because I was spent all the time at Stellenbosch. I went to Cape Town a few times. It's like, why am I not at Cape Town? Such a gorgeous, beautiful city, so beautiful.
Yeah, but also hopefully, more to offer than just the mountain and the ocean. And there would be lots more good conversations. So thank you. And I think we're going to continue to read your work and actually have a real conversation in person. So thank you so much.
Yeah,
and thanks everyone who is attending at this late hour, wherever you are in different parts of the world. Thanks.
Thank everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.